Hi, nurses. Welcome to Shift Change, the podcast for nurses who are ready to shift their thinking away from the just a nurse mentality and into claiming their position as powerful agents for change. I'm your host, Amy Deagle, Chief Nursing Officer and President of the International Network of Nurse Leaders. Our mission at the International Network of Nurse Leaders is to amplify the voice of nurses, inspire the new generation of nurse leaders, and lead a change revolution in the nursing profession. Everything we do is because we believe in the power of nurses to change the world. So let's get started. Hi, nurses. Welcome back to the Shift Change podcast. I'm your host, Amy Deagle, and I am so excited to bring you this bonus episode of the Shift Change podcast. We have our first non-nursing guest today. And the reason I asked this guest to come on is because when I did the Not Just a Nurse Day in October 2019, in my Not Just a Nurse Day speech, I referenced this moment that I had seen in a TED Talk called Lollipop moments and how we have the opportunity to create everyday acts of leadership. And I reached out to the speaker of the TED Talk and asked for his permission to use his work and his example in my speech. And not only did he respond in saying, absolutely, I could use it, he also offered to chat with me further, which I asked if he would be open to doing a podcast, and he said yes. So I am really excited to be bringing you my interview with Dudley, who is called one of the most inspirational TED Talk speakers in the world. He is on a mission to help people unlearn some dangerous lessons about leadership. As the founder and chief catalyst of Day One Leadership, he has helped top organizations around the world increase their leadership capacity. His clients have included McDonald's, American Express, JP Morgan Chase, the United Way, and more than 100 colleges and universities. Prior to that, Drew spent 8 years as a director of one of Canada's largest leadership development programs at the University of Toronto. Drew is also the best-selling author of This is Day One, A Practical Guide to Leadership That Matters. It debuted at number 6 on the Wall Street Journal bestseller list. As a speaker, Drew has delivered keynotes to more than 250,000 people across 5 continents. His TED Talk, Everyday Leadership, The Lollipop Moment, was voted one of the 15 most inspirational TED Talks of all time. So welcome to the Shift Change podcast, Drew. I am thrilled to have you here with us today.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I just mentioned to everybody, you are our first non-nurse guest on the show, and I wanted to bring you on to discuss leadership, specifically everyday leadership, and you literally wrote the book on this, so I really can't wait to dive in, but thank you for being our first non-nurse guest.
Well, thank you for being willing to slum with somebody who isn't doing a job that actually matters. So I appreciate being able to horn in on what is a long list of guests who actually do good things for the world. And now it's just, dude who types stuff. So I like it.
No, you are an expert on leadership, and this is what this podcast is about. So I am really grateful to be able to talk to you today. So to start, why don't we dive in a little bit? I would just love for you to tell us a bit about yourself, your story, how you came to be a world-renowned TED Talk speaker, and your journey through leadership and what it's been like this far.
Sure. Well, it was basically an accident. I think if you talk to anybody who really loves what they do, they'll tell you that the path was not planned out to go that way. When I was in university, forget it. Let's start earlier. When I was in high school, I thought I was everything a student was supposed to be because I got really great grades. And let's face it, when you're younger, that is the primary source of accolades when you're young. You're either really good at school or you're a great athlete, and everybody else falls somewhere below that. And so because I didn't run very fast, what I convinced myself was, okay, if you want to be someone impressive, you have to tie up your entire self-worth in how you do in school. And I did really well. And what happened was, when you have really good grades in high school and you like science, you're supposed to be a doctor. And if you don't like science, you're supposed to be a lawyer. And that's what I did. I went off to university to be a lawyer and very rapidly discovered that I really preferred interacting with the world compared to writing papers on it or commenting on it. And so ultimately, what happened is I started to get involved in charities. Specifically, I got involved in the charity Shinorama, which is the student arm of the Canadian Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, now CF Canada. And I just fell in love with working with people to raise money, or I thought that's what I loved. It turns out that what I really loved doing was building teams, setting goals, and chasing them. It just so happened that every time we did it, it was in support of some sort of charity. And so I dove into the world of professional fundraising only to discover that it's a terrible, cutthroat world where people are treated based on how much money they can give you, no matter how big a jerk they might be. And so I rapidly learned that, oh, I made a mistake here. I thought that I loved fundraising. What I loved doing was putting teams of brilliant people together and doing good things. And what I began doing when I moved up the ranks of the National Shinorama Committee, the CF Canada Committee, I discovered that I had a talent for doing workshops that taught people how to engage in particular leadership behaviors. At first, it was really practical. It was, hey, how do you plan an event that's safe? How do you get sponsorship when you're very young for your events? How do you market effectively when you don't have a budget? How do you build a team that's on the same page when everybody's not getting paid? And that experience led me to be asked, you do it in one place, someone likes it, they ask you to do it in another. And eventually the dean of the University of Toronto was in the back of one of these workshops. I didn't know he was there. And the next thing you know, he's approaching me and saying, hey, the way you talk about leadership is really applicable to young people. It's the type of leadership that individuals who've never thought of themselves as leaders, in this case, because they're university students and relatively young, this is the type of leadership that isn't all theory, that isn't all textbook, that students will actually see as a way of doing things. Would you come and help us build this program at the University of Toronto? Which I said, sure, of course. I never thought of myself in that role and fell in love with it. And for close to a decade, built that program at U of T up into one of the biggest ones in Canada. We had over 1,000 students participating in it each year. And eventually, honestly, the only thing that was keeping me from sharing the ideas we were teaching and the process that we had developed wider was the fact I had a full-time job. And once the work environment got toxic enough, which happens when you add a couple of people whose values don't align, I started to realize, you know what? The only thing keeping me from doing what I love full-time is this idea that you're supposed to have a job, this idea that your life is supposed to progress in a certain way, and to leave one of the most prestigious schools in Canada, and trust me, they will repeat that fact to you as many times as humanly possible, was silly. Why would you do that? Like, you have exactly what people are looking for here. And my whole life I'd been taught, I was getting what people should chase. And as I've seen, a lot of people have probably experienced, when you're told that you should chase something your whole life, and then you get it, and it doesn't make you feel good, then you get a little panicked because you've always just sort of accepted that this is the way it's supposed to be. And now you're getting all the stuff you've dedicated your time and you sacrificed for, and it's not having a really positive impact on you. That can be a little scary. And the TED Talking concept or the speaking, people started asking me, teach the stuff you do in the classrooms. Come and speak here at this event or that event or this charity. And I was loving it. But one of the things that sort of caught me off guard was when one of my own students came in and said, hey, there's this TED conference in Toronto. And I had just discovered TED Talks. I had started to implement them into my workshops, and my students had discovered how much I love TED Talks. And they discovered there was one in Toronto. This was early on in the phenomena of TEDx Talks. I think there was only about 10 around the world at this point. So they were not common. And he came in and said, hey, there's a TED Talk in Toronto. Would you come and you should speak at it? Like, they have an open nomination system. And I said, I'm just a part-time speaker. The problem was that I had always told my students that they're not allowed to call themselves just anything. You're not just a student. You're not just middle management. You're not just a nurse. This powerful diminishing word we use all the time to diminish who we are and what we do. I'd always told them, you're not allowed to use that word around me. And the problem is, if you repeat something to someone enough times and then you try to pull that crap on them, they were having none of it. And so without my knowledge, they created a campaign through social media, because at the time I wasn't on social media, to get me to speak at TEDx Toronto. They started a nomination process, and sure enough, about 6 days after I left the university and was sort of figuring out what's next in my life, I got the call saying, "Hey, you've got 6 minutes on stage." And I said, "Well, I can't introduce myself in 6 minutes, as you probably already learned." And didn't know what to do. And I had one single story that a friend of mine said, "You tell this one story and it impacts people, and you need to tell it on stage." And I said to him, "Well, I can't tell that story. It's about lollipops. It doesn't have enough gravitas." And there's this long pause on the phone. And then I'm reminded that I have the best kind of friends, because he just says, "You need to get over yourself. Your whole message is that not enough people call themselves leaders because they made it into something too big and too complex and too beyond most of us. And now you're not going to tell the most impactful story that you have because it doesn't make you sound smart enough. You need to get over yourself." And so I went up, I told this short 6 minute story about a single moment involving a lollipop, where a girl told me that I had a profound impact on her life and I didn't know it. And sure enough, in that audience was a speakers bureau, an agent who came out and said, "You can do this professionally." And the talk went online, went viral, 5 million people watched it. And now I'm on podcasts, talking to people about this idea that we made leadership into something bigger than us. And because it's put on a pedestal, most of us don't see it as a part of our identity. And since that time, 2010, when I told that short little talk, I've spoken at over 1,000 different places on 5 continents, trying to share this idea that we have turned leadership into a tiny club that not enough people think they can or should be in. And if we start to change that, we're going to have a much better set of workplaces, much better communities, because we will have fewer people diminishing what makes them extraordinary.
I love that. And you've hit on so many of the things I wanted to talk about today, and so many of the messages that through the International Network of Nurse Leaders, we're trying to hammer home to nurses, that every nurse is a leader. And so actually, we got connected because I was writing a keynote for Not Just a Nurse Day virtual summit that I hosted this fall. And I wanted to reference your TED Talk in it about, your lollipop moments. And so I reached out to you just to make sure it was cool. I referenced it, and this is how we ended up booking this podcast. But I want to talk about that concept of just. So in your book, you talk about the 5 ways you can embody impact today. And one is to be on the lookout for the word just. Right? And you state in your book to politely remind anyone who uses it that they are not just anything. So we had a whole day about not just a nurse day and why we need to lose that mentality in nursing. So can you dive in a little bit more around that mentality of using the word just to describe ourselves?
Yeah, I think that one of the big things I always try to get across to young people, because this is where it starts, right? Things that we allow to continue unchecked when we're young, we'd never start questioning them once we're older. Just is a powerful diminisher that gets used all the time. And I think we start using it because we're trying to help ourselves out. Because I think when we start using word just originally, it's usually in terms of the things that we're doing. So I just need to get the kids out the door. I just need to pick up the laundry. I just need to get through this meeting or through these emails. Because I think what we're doing is, in order to try to keep ourselves from feeling overwhelmed, what we do is we try to trick our brain into thinking that all these things we have to do every day aren't going to take a lot of time. Well, it's just these emails, right? So what we're trying to do is trick ourselves into, this isn't actually a big project, so I'm not going to be scared of it. And I get that. The challenge is that the stuff that we usually use the word just in front of we use the word just. Sorry, I got a grammatical friend who I know listens to these podcasts, and I think I still got it wrong. But what we're trying to do is convince ourselves, oh, it's not going to be a big thing. But since most of the things we say just about are the things that take up most of our lives, what we're really doing is we're trying to trick our brain into minimizing the stuff that takes up most of our days. And when we really think about what we're doing there, what is it saying to ourselves when we diminish the acts that take up most of our lives? If we say they're nothing big and they're not important, and we're doing that so that we don't feel overwhelmed by how much time they're going to take, we are at the same time telling ourselves that the stuff that makes up the majority of your day isn't important. And subconsciously, I think that does a lot of damage to us. When we start to diminish for our own protection the stuff that makes up most of our days, what we're really doing is we're embedding this idea that most of the stuff that I do isn't important. And we played a role in that. And I think that it's important to know that. And so that's, I think, where Just began. It began as a way for busy people to protect themselves from feeling overwhelmed. But what happened is it spilled over into how we talk about who we are and what we do in this world. So at first it starts with, I just have to get these charts done. I just have to do my emails. And then it becomes, I'm just a nurse. I'm just a receptionist. I'm just a student. And what happens is now it's moved from the stuff that we do to who we are as people, how we identify ourselves. And that's a dangerous thing. And I think one of the things I try to get across is leaders never allow people who they know are people of worth to diminish themselves in front of you. And that's really important to me. And for me, it all started when I was asked to speak at my old high school. I didn't realize that this was a thing. I didn't realize that I was doing it until, after I've been able to be on TV and achieve some level of notoriety. I get asked to come back and speak at my old high school. And that's scary. I don't care how old you are. Like when you walk back through the doors of your high school, you become the person you were in high school.
Yeah.
And for me, a kid who didn't really fit in high school, one of the people who made it much better was a guy by the name of Mr. Peters, and he was the head custodian at our high school. And I had a lot of great teachers, so I don't want to diminish that, but this man was so kind, and he had such an attuned concept of who among us felt bullied and alienated and left out, and he would talk to us, and he would make us feel seen. And I think that at the time I didn't realize how powerful that was, but 15 years later, I'm back at the school about to give a speech, and Mr. Peters sees me, and he comes busting into the room, and he gives me this big bear hug, and he says, Drew Dudley, I'm so thrilled you're here. And, it's been 15 years at this point since I graduated, and I said to him, Mr. Peters, I can't believe you remember my name. Mm-hmm. And he said, remember your name? No, Drew, I've been following your whole career. I'm so proud of you. And that thing when someone says, I'm so proud of you, it makes you, it hits you powerfully when you know they're telling the truth. Yeah. And it also makes you think about all of the people in your life of whom you're really proud. And we all have those people, but have we actually told them? It's one of those moments of leadership that we allow to be shoved off our agenda so we can replace it with busy work. And I at that moment, though, I realized that, now I've reframed what leadership means to me. And I realized that this man and his kindness and his ability to make people feel seen and like they mattered and like he could remember their name 15 years later, he embodied the type of leadership that I ignored when I was a kid because it wasn't attached to money and fame and power. Mm-hmm. But in that moment, I told him that. I said, I get the chance to travel around the world and I get paid a lot of money to talk about and teach a form of leadership that you embody perfectly. And though I didn't realize it then, I do now. And I wanted to tell you, you're an extraordinary leader, sir. And that's when he looked at me and he says, I'm just a janitor who knows you guys before you make it big. Mm-hmm. And that was the first time that I became aware of that word and what it does when people who care about you hear it come out of your mouth. And I get why he said it. Because, like it or not, one of those untaught lessons in education is how you should feel about your role on this planet should be in part determined by where you fall on the spectrum of financial compensation. Mm-hmm. And he's talking to a guy at that moment who's been on TV and written bestsellers and gets asked to come back and give speeches. And he's doing a job that we, disgustingly, will use to scare kids into working harder. Like, you don't want to be a janitor, right? And so he was acknowledging that in that moment, that unspoken thing that we all know, which is, hey, it doesn't matter how we behave every day. You are more impressive than I am. And what has become clear to me, and the reason I like talking about him when I talk about the word just, is because in the 30-some years that he worked at that school, he interacted with thousands of students who have gone on to become all of these things that we celebrate as successful: doctors and lawyers and architects and engineers and CEOs. And I interview those people. That's part of my job, is to interview people who the world would objectively call successful, to ask them about their values and their insights. And I interview those people who I went to high school with, because now you can get an interview because, hey, we went to high school together. And when I get the chance to sit down with these individuals in their corner offices, I, at some point during the interview, if I went to high school with them, will ask them, like, hey, do you remember Mr. Peters? And every single one of them, when I mention his name, they smile. And it's been 15 or 20 years since they last saw that man, and they smile at the mere mention of his name. And I argue that that is a life of leadership, and that is a life of legacy, and that is not just anything. But we do not celebrate it. We don't teach it when we're kids, and to our kids. And what happens is, when we grow up to be anything that isn't one of those things that are supposed to be celebrated, we inherently embody this idea that we are just something. That man is not just anything. That man is much more significant than a lot of people who make a lot more money, a lot of people who would consider themselves a lot more impressive, but people don't matter as much as that guy. And Mr. Peters is the first person who ever said just and actually hurt me when I heard it. And that's when I started to talk a lot about this word and how unconsciously we use it, and how in the process we're not only diminishing ourselves, which is bad enough, but we're teaching our kids to do it too. And that's something that, even if we're willing to screw ourselves over, most of us aren't willing to screw over the people we care about more than ourselves.
Yeah, it's such a powerful word, and it does diminish that. And I know a lot of nurses are using that, like, oh, I'm not the doctor, I'm just the nurse. And it's so frustrating because we are experts in our own right. And so really just trying to bang this message home that, we need to acknowledge that we are leaders. Hey nurses, I just wanted to take a quick break from the podcast and tell you about something really important that's happening. So 2020 has been designated as Year of the Nurse and the Midwife. And it's really great to be celebrating nurses and to be sharing trending hashtags. But what we really need to do is get into action, because it's up to us. And nothing is going to change if we don't make the change. So there's a movement happening, and it needs you. We're stronger together. So come join us as we disrupt the status quo and evolve our profession. It's time. We are stronger together, so let's get started. If you want to know how you can join this movement of change, visit nurseleaders.ca/2020nurse to opt in for a free 3-part video series about how we can use 2020, the Year of the Nurse and Midwife, as the year we finally use our collective voice and lead our profession forward. So jump over to nurseleaders.ca/2020nurse for all the details. Now back to the episode. And so I want you to talk about your book, This is Day One, because you told me you basically wrote this book with nurses in mind. So can you tell us about the book and the main elements that you see nurses being able to use in their everyday life to really claim their position as leaders?
Yeah, I mean, when I thought about it, when people call and say, we'd like you to speak, and their teachers are nurses, I'm all over that. Because when I really broke it down, the type of people who use that word, that I'm trying to think of professions where there's a bigger gap between actual effort that's expended and how people perceive the importance of a group of people. Like, nurses and teachers are my people. Like, these are the individuals who make people feel their humanity. And I think it, as different as it is, students are young and they feel like they don't matter. And so teachers have this extraordinary ability to help young people see that they do, in fact, matter, that they do have a role in this world. And that shapes them. But as a general rule, the compensation they get for that effort isn't commensurate with what other people do that enriches a small group of people. Nurses do the same thing in many ways in a even more difficult environment because the shifts are longer, the pay in some cases is even worse, and the environment is so difficult to navigate because there's so many emotions. And how easy it is within, and I do this because my father has spent so much time in hospitals over the years, the ability to lose someone's sense of humanity is so easy within the healthcare industry, right? And especially as more and more of our population gets older, they become more lonely. And what we start to see is that it's easy to stop seeing as yourself as a person and start seeing yourself as just a burden. And I think what makes nurses so extraordinary is the level of interaction that they have in this environment where people's humanity is always feeling tenuous. Do they matter? I'm scared. My family is scared. People are angry. People are short. And nurses navigate like between the egos of doctors and the fears of patients and family members and the loneliness of people who are there on their own. There's so much that allows people to feel like less than they are within the healthcare industry. And in my experience, it is nurses who can create those individual moments that even for half a moment, a second, remind someone of their humanity, remind someone that they are not a burden, remind somebody that at least somebody for a moment cares. That is the most powerful stuff we can do. So for me, one of the key tenets of my book is that we are defining leadership too narrowly. From a very young age, when we're taught what leadership is, the examples we're given are giants, presidents, scientific groundbreakers, people who conquer empires. And whatever examples you're given to learn a concept, whatever examples you're given first, not only do they shape your understanding of that idea for the rest of your life, but they limit it. And so we teach leadership as being about money and power and influence. And it teaches us to diminish the leadership that we demonstrate every day because it's not associated with a hierarchical position. It's not associated with being in charge. And it's not associated with anything but the people who are considered the most important. And as a result, we start to ignore the moments of leadership that we demonstrate every day. And when I say moments of leadership, I don't mean moments of power and influence, things that get you paid, things that get you profile. What I'm talking about are moments of compassion and empathy and kindness and forgiveness. Those moments, those individual moments that are created between often just two people are the most powerful things that any one of us has to shape the environments we're in and the world that we're in and the people we interact with. When you create a moment of empathy or kindness, it is so much more impactful than anything that the CEO of a hospital foundation does on a given day for most of the people around them. And so what happens is we don't call these individual moments of interpersonal impact, we don't call them leadership. We call them the little things. Oh, it's the little things. It's the kindness. It's the remembering someone's name. It's the smile. Like, oh, it's just the little things that we do. They're not little. They're wildly powerful. And why I think it's so important to recognize that these individual moments of interpersonal interaction are leadership is because it's one of the rare sources of power on this planet that are available to everyone. Like most of the sources of power on Earth are not available to most of the people on Earth. Most of the sources of power on this planet have systemic barriers between most of the people on Earth and those sources of power, especially if you're not lucky enough, like I am, to be a straight white guy. There's barriers between most power and most people, except these moments of interpersonal impact. That power is available to everyone, no matter where you're from, what you do, how much money you make, or how smart you think you are. And my argument in the book is that we need to broaden the definition of leadership. Not everybody can or should be a CEO or wants to be, but there is a form of leadership to which we all can and should aspire. And leadership are moments where you change people's understanding of what their world is in that moment. and a moment of kindness when someone's lonely, a moment of hope when someone is hopeless, a moment of having someone feel seen when they feel like they haven't been in so long. That is so much more empowering and important than anything that the president, that's a bad example these days, but like anything that Elon Musk is going to do. Yeah, it looks cool, but why does it matter to you? And why does it matter to that patient? And why does it matter to their child who's terrified? And you come in and you're singing a song, and I know that sounds cheesy, but one nurse I knew was always like hammering out this beautiful music when she came in the room. And I don't think she realized that hearing her come down the hallway, it was just like room after room after room had this individual moment in the course of what could otherwise be, if not terrifying, mind-numbingly boring day. Mm-hmm. That was as big an act of leadership as anything you're going to see from someone on television. In fact, it mattered a lot more to the people in the room there. So that's what my idea with the book is that we will allow our lives to go through our lives doing the work we're supposed to do and never making time to be the people we want to be. And I think that, to me, leadership is closing the gap between the person you want to be and how you're actually behaving. And that gap exists for all of us. Don't be ashamed of it. It's there for everybody. And sometimes most people don't deny that gap exists. Mm-hmm. What we do is we rationalize it as temporary. Well, I've got this gap between who I want to be and how I'm behaving, but just until I graduate, just until I pay off my loans, just until the wedding, until the baby comes, until the kids are out of the house, we'll always have an excuse to rationalize that gap. My argument is that day one of leadership, a type of leadership everyone can and should aspire to, day one is when you say, these are the non-negotiable behaviors that will be a part of every day of my life, no matter what else I have to do that day. I'm going to make sure that I give myself evidence every day that I actually am the person I claim to be. And it's shocking how few of us can actually provide ourselves with that evidence every day. It really is. And so what I did is I wrote a book that said, imagine this is day one of your leadership voyage. Forget what you've done in the past. Forget what you're going to do tomorrow. Just today. If you were going to start today being the person that you've not made time for because of how much you're serving other people, then here's where you start. Here are the non-negotiable behaviors. Here's how to identify them. Here's how to live them every day. Here's a born in behavioral psychology. Here's how to actually make yourself do them. And here's how to give yourself credit for them. That was my idea. Here's where you start on day one, because there is no one day of who you want to be, physical health, mental health, career success. There's no one day that doesn't start with a day one. And on day one, you say, there are some things that are non-negotiable from this day forward. And I want to convince people that, one, they have those things. Here's how to find them. Here's how to make them more than just words and actually turn them into behaviors. And here's why, when you do that, you should give yourself credit as an incredibly important leader. And the reason I say I wrote it for nurses is because nurses will say just all the time. Nurses will work so hard doing things that most people never do, but because it's all you've ever done, you don't realize how much harder it is than most people's jobs. And as a result, especially when you're surrounded with people who've been patted on the back and taught that they're better than other people. Now, not every doctor is a jackass, but way too many are, right? What's the difference between God and a doctor? You know, a God doesn't think he's a doctor. But and look, maybe that's wrong, and maybe I just pissed some people off. But you spend enough time in the medical system, particularly in hospitals, which I know is not the only place nurses work, but you start to realize that where a lot of the work is being done. And I don't want to minimize the hard work and education that doctors get, but the society looks at their accomplishments at a much different lens than they do nurses. And as a result, if you're a nurse and you're faced with that all the time, that maybe you're doing this huge amount of work, but these individuals are given a different sort of reverence within a system, you start to internalize that even if you don't like it. And my argument is that we need to give the same sort of credit and level of importance to the moments of leadership that nurses create in creating moments of humanity, where humanity is seen, where humanity is celebrated, where humanity is bolstered in people who might not feel it. That's real leadership. And you know what? That saves lives too. It really does. Even if just for a moment, it turns people around in a way that makes them, I think, much more conducive to healing.
Mm-hmm. So I love that you mentioned about practicing leadership every day and closing that gap of, where you are now and who you want to be. So what does a daily leadership practice look like? Can you give some examples if there's some nurses out there listening right now that are like, okay, yeah, I get this, I'm bought in, but now what? What would that actually look like?
And thanks for asking that, because that's a big part of the work that I do. Is I don't just want to be someone who says, hey, we should look at it differently. So let me give the story of the first time we ever put this into practice, because it started when a student said to me, he was fighting with one of those decisions where you have two options, one that gives you what you want and one that allows you to be the person you want to be. Mm-hmm. And let's face it, sometimes those two things don't work together. Mm-hmm. And he announced to me that, damn, it's a lot easier to stand up for something than it is to live up to it, isn't it? And I thought, damn, that's smart for a 20-year-old. And it turns out he stole it, but we'll roll with it anyway. But I used to tell my students, you never steal anything in leadership, you benchmark a best practice. But it made me think, let's actually see if we can live up to the things we claim to stand for. And so I gave my students this challenge. I said, pick one value that you think should define you and the people who go to this school. One value that, whatever value you choose, imagine that it was guaranteed that everyone would do one thing every day that lives up to that value. Now, it wouldn't be the only value up to which people live, but it's the only one you get guaranteed. If you had that power for yourself and for this entire community, which one would you pick? One guaranteed thing that happens. And they picked impact as their value. Now, I argue that words like values get thrown around a lot, and they generally don't mean anything, because a value is a value only if you use it as criteria for decision making. And so that's what a value is. It's not just some word like integrity or respect or honor that sounds good or looks good on the wall of your hospital or your website, right? Unless a value is considered every time a decision is made, unless when you're looking at the options, you compare them to your values and say, which one of these is the best fit, they're not actually values. Mm-hmm. And that also means you can't throw these words around without defining them. So when my students said, we want to live up to impact, I said, okay, what does that mean? Like, finish this sentence. Impact is a commitment to what? And try that in your own minds with any of these words we use all the time to define ourselves and other people. Respect is a commitment to what? Inclusivity is a commitment to what? Compassion is a commitment to what? So I said, you're not allowed to say this is what you want to define you daily unless you can tell me exactly what it's a commitment to in terms of behaviors. And they said, impact is a commitment to creating moments that cause people to feel as if they are better off for having interacted with you. And I said, that's good. Mm-hmm. Go do it. That's your assignment. For a week, you go out and you create a moment like that, because it means you're living up to who you want to be. And then the thing is, I don't want you to not do it all week and then write a paper where you lie about it. You have to come into my office every day before you go home, look me in the eye and tell me what you did. And it was a really interesting assignment, but not because of why I thought it would be. What I found interesting is every day those students would come, and outside my office, they'd pause for a second, and I would watch them. And in their mind, what they were doing is they were looking back over the course of their day, and they were trying to identify a moment where they'd done that, where they'd made someone walk away feeling better off for the interaction. And because they were great kids, they almost always had one. But what I realized they were doing is they were using this value to evaluate behavior that had already happened. And leaders don't do that. Leaders use their values to drive their behavior, to impact decision-making in the moment. They think about their values all day long when they make decisions. And that wasn't happening. We were only thinking about it at the end of the day to look back. And so we needed a different approach. And so I went to the psych department and I said, do you have any subconscious psychological motivators that we could combine with this desire to act a certain way that would help us? Because life gets in the way of just doing what you want to do. Mm-hmm. And they gave me two. One called the Zygarnik effect, which says that things on your to-do list that you haven't yet completed take up a more prominent spot in your consciousness than things that you have completed. In other words, stuff that you have to do that you haven't yet finished bugs you until you finish it. And I did not know there was a scientific term for that. The other is the question behavior effect, which says you ask people a series of questions about a particular behavior in the morning, and they're way more likely to engage in that behavior later on in the day, whether they're aware of it or not. You ask someone over breakfast a bunch of questions about generosity, and they're going to do something generous later on in the day. They're not even going to know why. And so what we did is we said, all right, if questions can drive human behavior without us being aware of it, and unfinished tasks actually make you psychically uncomfortable until you finish them, you know what we're going to use as a tool to power our behavior? We're going to try to harness the power of the unanswered question, because the human brain hates unanswered questions. If I stick a question in your head and you don't have the answer, you're going to work on it consciously. And then when you think you stop working on it, you're not. You've just moved it to the unconscious. And your brain will keep looking for an answer until it finds one. And if it can't find one, it's going to make one up and convince you that it's right. And so, for instance, if you've ever thought about the name of an actor or an actress and you can't remember, and then you promise yourself you're not going to Google it, and then you forget about it, but sometime in the next 36 to 48 hours when you're in the shower or driving your car, like that name pops into your head.
Yeah.
That's the Zeigarnik effect. And so what we did is we said, okay, instead of just saying this is what we want to stand for, having a definition and trying to live up to the definition, we turned it into a question. Instead of saying, how did I create a moment that caused someone to walk away feeling better off, we created, what did I do today to recognize someone else's leadership? That became the question, because that question can't be answered yes or no. That question demands a specific action, and you have to be able to say who, what, where, why, when, and how. How did I recognize someone else's leadership today? And because leadership's on a pedestal, we figured if you tell someone that the way they do their job, the way they've made you feel, the way they helped you out was leadership to you, nobody walks away from that not feeling better off, right? And so that became the assignment. Find an answer to this question. Every morning, remind yourself this is an expectation, and then go find an answer. And what we did is we said, let's try this out and see if it's different. See if it has a bigger impact. See if it makes us think about our value more often. And to say it did is a dramatic understatement. That question made me quit my job and go start teaching this everywhere in the world, because my students destroyed that assignment. Their former coaches, their former teachers, the incredibly nice guy who served hot dogs on campus, their parents. One guy waited for his bus driver from kindergarten to grade 8 to tell him how much it meant to him that he sang every day on the way to school, and that the kids in the back made fun of him the whole time, and the bus driver just kept singing. And the student who told him this had been so fat and so smart and so bullied that he told that bus driver that I go to Harvard for grad school next year, and you're as big a part of that as any teacher I ever had. And so we did that. We answered the question, what did I do today to recognize someone else's leadership, in an effort to live our value of impact? And it worked so well that the next month we came up with another value, and the month after that, and the month after that. And by the end of the school year, we had what we called the leadership test, 6 questions. And each question, through answering it, you would live a core value that we thought were important to us. And what happened was we took on a different mindset. And this is what I try to teach people in order to not ignore your leadership and to make sure you live it. Imagine if every night before you go to bed, you had to prove you deserved another day on this planet. Not at the end of a shift, not at the end of a year, not at the end of a 5-year plan. Every single night you had to prove you deserved another day on the planet. And in order to prove it, you have to pass a test. You need to get three questions out of 6. The bonus is you're given the questions in the morning. If that was our reality, those questions would be non-negotiable. They would be the primary things we tried to do every day. We wouldn't do them in between shifts or emails or picking up the kids. They would be what drove us every day. And because those questions were tied directly to the values we wanted to define ourselves as people, what that approach does is it makes you prioritize your to-be list above your to-do list. And that is something that a lot of us have stopped doing. You can live your to-be list through your to-do list, But if you don't consciously say, these are the values I want to live up to every day and I want to prove it to myself, here are the questions I need to do that, and then here are the questions I got today, ultimately you just let your to-be lists shift off to the side, and we do it when we have extra time, and we don't have extra time. So, for instance, my work is helping people figure out what their own values are and create their own questions, their own leadership test. But if you're listening today and you wanted to know what sort of drives me every day so that I don't diminish the stuff that really matters, what that I do in this world, not whether I wrote a book or I get to go on podcasts, but at the end of today, whether I can honestly tell myself that I was someone who mattered to other people, I ask, what did I do to recognize someone else's leadership so I have impact? I ask, what did I do today to make it more likely someone would learn something to embody the value of growth? I ask, what did I try today that might not work, but I tried it anyway to embody the value of courage? What did I do today to help someone else move closer to a goal for the value of empowerment? When did I elevate a situation that I could have escalated today for the value of class? And what did I do today to be good to myself for the value of self-respect? Those 6 questions, if I get 3 out of 6 every day, I can go home knowing that even if everything outside of my control blew up in my face today, I at least got 3 of my 6 questions. And so today was a loss, but I was the man I wanted to be through all of this. And some days that's the only thing that you get, is knowledge that you were the person that you wanted to be. And that's how I practically try to turn values into actual behaviors, by saying, this is what I want to stand for, here's what it means, and here's the question that cannot be answered without living that. And I'm going to make that question a part of my daily expectations, because when you stick the question in your brain as an expectation, you actually make your brain uncomfortable until you answer it. That's what I encourage people to do.
And that is incredibly powerful. Thank you for sharing that. Wow. And so if people are interested in learning more, that is what you dive into in your book and your talks, correct?
Yeah, 100%. It's about how do you create your own leadership test, and just where do you start, right? No matter how long you've been doing it, you can do a restart today. And a lot of it comes from, I'm a recovering alcoholic. And if you don't want to have a drink for the rest of your life, you have to choose not to have a drink today. And the only thing you worry about is that challenge today, not what happened yesterday or tomorrow, because yesterday and tomorrow, they just distract you from what you need to accomplish today. And, I had day 1 of that, day 1 of talking about being someone with bipolar, which took a long time to do, but now I commit to it every day, because what it does is it liberates me and other people for talking about it. It's all about, I had day 1 of losing 100 pounds. Every single voyage you want to go on, you say, this has to happen every day, and I will only worry about doing it today. Because if you string enough of those first days together, and day 1 has like commitment, humility, and forgiveness tied up in it. If you string enough day 1s together, eventually it makes up every day of your life. That, I think, is the key. So the book and my speeches are about, okay, what are your values? And how can we help you with your questions? And then let you get started on your day 1.
That's great. So we're going to make sure that your book and the links to your different TED Talks and stuff are all linked in the show notes and on the blog page. And I'm just mindful of time. I have one last kind of question I want to ask you before we wrap up. So one of the things I hear from nurses is regarding their confidence to speak up. And I know you touch on this in your book about confidence versus courage. And I know you just mentioned courage is one of those values. Could you just explain a bit more about that and offer any suggestions you might have to nurses that are dealing with a confidence struggle as it relates to their leadership abilities and speaking up in their work environments?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I really like that distinction because especially introverts often immediately don't consider themselves leaders because they say, I don't like speaking up, and they confuse that with a lack of confidence. Discomfort with being the center of attention is not the same as a lack of confidence. But I was once at a speech, and afterwards a young guy came up and said, my friend wants to talk to you, but he doesn't interact with strangers very well. Looking back, I realized he probably was on the spectrum. But I said, yeah, no problem. Come on and let's have him talk. And this young guy was incredibly nice, but he kept leaving in the middle of the conversation to gather himself and then come back. And he kept apologizing. And I said to him, don't, like, I have friends who deal with a lot of powerful social anxiety. It takes a lot of guts to come up and talk to a stranger. So don't apologize for it. And he said something that I've heard since, but I had never heard it prior to him saying it. He said, the quality of my life is pretty much determined by how often I can answer the question, am I capable of 5 seconds of extraordinary courage right now? And that phrase, am I capable of 5 seconds of extraordinary courage, really resonated with me, because we always are. Now, we may convince ourselves we're not because we don't think we have the courage for what happens 5 minutes from now or a year from now. But in any given moment, we have 5 seconds of extraordinary courage. And why I focus on courage is because confidence is acting like something doesn't scare you, or even maybe even believing it doesn't scare you. But confidence is all about how you act. Courage is all about, how you act in terms of, your confidence is acting like things don't scare you. Courage is acknowledging they scare you and taking action anyway. Mm-hmm. So what that means is that confidence can exist in the absence of action. What I mean by that is that you can be confident all your life and never do anything to prove it. But you're still confident because you act as if you're not scared. But courage only exists in the face of action. Courage does not come into existence until someone does something that scares them, which means that some of the best leaders I know are not confident people, because they are always afraid, and they are always open about the fact that they are afraid. But they're incredibly courageous because they take action anyway. And some of the most confident people I know, I can't point to a single moment where they've done something where there was the possibility of loss to them. But they act very confident, and that's the vibe that people get. Wow, what a confident person. But you can't point to one single courageous act they've actually taken. They just walk around acting like they're not scared. But some of the people I know who are open about how they're scared, who are open about the fact that they are afraid of what they're about to do, but they do it anyway, that's courage. Leadership is defined by courage, not by confidence, because courage is defined by action and confidence isn't.
Great. Okay. Well, the hour flew by, honestly. So there are so many more things I would like to dive into, but we're just going to have to leave that for another time, I think. To wrap up, Drew, is there any parting words or pieces of advice that you wanted to leave with our audience today?
Yeah. One, consider the question, why do you matter? Because I've asked that question to hundreds, thousands of people probably, and most people can't give me an answer to that. And really sit down and imagine that some strange dude looked at you during a speech and said, why do you matter? And realize that for most of us, we've never been asked that. And that's dangerous, because you do matter. And we need to recognize that we matter. And if we don't ask ourselves and give ourselves evidence that we do, we forget it. And if you have kids, go home and ask them that question, because they're going through an education system that is slowly teaching them that why they matter isn't up to them to determine. Rather, it's supposed to be evaluated externally. And remember that, okay, that you need to be able to answer, why do I matter? And you need to ask the people you care about, because once you ask them, they're forced to come up with an answer. And most of us don't bother doing it. I'll also mention, if you want to give you 3 things, ask, why do you matter? Recognize that only hurt people hurt others. I think that someone told me that once, a young woman that said, only hurt people hurt others. And remember that almost all the pain that's been passed on to you from someone else came from someone else who had hurt them. Mm-hmm. And now we get to decide whether or not we carry that hurt around and use it as a weapon against someone else, or we find a way to let it die with us. And then the last one, I guess that ultimately recognize that, try to treat yourself with the same amount of respect that you treat your phone. And I know that sounds like an odd thing, but during speeches, I'll put up a photograph of the little battery with the red line, that's down to 10%. Mm-hmm. And it just makes people uncomfortable, right? Like if that thing shows up in the top right-hand corner of your phone, your whole life becomes about it. People in $5,000 suits sitting on the floors of airports to charge their phone. Mm-hmm. If your phone hits 10%, you're irresponsible. If you hit 10% emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, you're dedicated. That's got to change. Self-respect is a commitment to recognizing that when you are empty, you have nothing to give. And I've seen very few professions that fall victim to this more than nursing. Mm-hmm. When you are empty, you have nothing to give. It is not self-indulgent to take care of yourself first so that you can care for these other people who you take so much pride in taking care of. A phone, you charge it whenever it starts to empty. You put an otter box around it and a protective glass thing over the top because you know it's going to get dropped and you know it's going to get smashed on the floor. And so in preparation of that, you protect it. You make sure it's as strong as possible. You invest in that protection. Treat yourself with the same respect you treat your phone. It's the only way that you can continue to serve the people you care about so much. You have to take care of yourself first. It's not being self-absorbed. It's something that makes you your best. So do it. You deserve it. Every last one of you deserves it, more than most of us.
Thank you for that. It's one of my messages that, we can't help others if we're not helping ourselves. And had some feedback that's, self-serving, and we need to always be the patients first and that we're serving the public. And while I agree that's part of it, if we're all empty, we're not doing a good job. So it's really nice to hear that reflected back from a member of the public. So thank you very much for that. And thank you for this interview, Drew. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today.
Oh, thank you so much. It's an honor to be asked, and especially knowing how many extraordinary people in your profession there are, the chance to come in and speak to a group of people who I know has made my life better, that saved my father's life. Keep doing what you're doing. You may not hear from us because we never want to go back into those places that were so scary for us, but you matter. You matter a lot.
Thank you. And just to wrap up, Drew, can you let them know where to find and connect with you? And we'll make sure it's all linked in the show notes as well, guys.
Of course. It's drewdudley.com. That's DREWDUDLEY.com. Everything is there. And I'm on pretty much every social media as Day One Drew, DAYONEDREW.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, guys. And make sure to check out Drew's book and also the TED Talks. They're going to be linked in the show notes. They'll be on nurseleaders.ca /podcast under Drew's episode as well. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here with us today. Have a good day. Bye. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you loved the advice shared on this episode, we would be so grateful if you would let us know. Please head over to Apple Podcasts, formerly known as iTunes, and subscribe to our show, and then rate us and leave your review. We would be so grateful if you would take the time to subscribe, rate, and review. While you're on our website, nurseleaders.ca /connect, all of our social media handles are there, and we would love to get to know you on social media as well. Thank you again for listening today, and remember, nurses, we have the power to change the world. Let's start today.